St. Petersburg, April 27, 2026. While the world was still absorbing the shockwaves of a ceasefire hanging by a thread, while American warships were blockading Iranian ports, while oil prices were hovering dangerously above $86 a barrel, and while Washington and Tehran traded accusations through Pakistani intermediaries, two men sat down in a room together: Vladimir Putin and Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, the man who has become the most traveled diplomat on earth in the past 60 days. What was said in that room in the next few hours did not just alter the trajectory of the U.S.-Iran war. It may have changed the entire outcome. This is what happened. This is why it matters. And this is what comes next. Part 1. The war that shook the world. How we got here. 60 days that changed everything. To understand why today's meeting in St. Petersburg is so significant, you need to understand the extraordinary sequence of events that brought us here. February 28, 2026, a date that will be remembered for generations. Under the cover of what appeared to be ongoing nuclear negotiations, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise strike on Iran. It was months in the planning. The deception was meticulous. Israeli military commanders reportedly drove their cars home from headquarters that night so that satellite imagery would show the base appearing calm, unprepared, and unarmed. Then they returned without their cars and launched one of the most audacious military operations in the history of the Middle East. In less than 30 minutes, 3 separate gatherings of senior Iranian regime officials were struck simultaneously. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was assassinated in an Israeli air attack. His daughter, son-in-law, grandchild, and daughter-in-law were also killed. The political earthquake was instant and global. But Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran did what it had been preparing to do for years. It hit back. Within hours, hundreds of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles were streaking toward Israel, toward U.S. military bases across the Gulf, in Qatar, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day, was shut down, effectively blockaded by Iranian naval and missile forces. Oil prices exploded upward, global markets convulsed, shipping companies scrambled, and the world held its breath, watching a conflict that many had feared for decades finally arrive in its full, terrifying reality. For the next 59 days, the war ground forward. U.S. and Israeli forces struck over 8,000 Iranian military targets. The Natanz nuclear facility was hit with bunker-buster bombs. Iranian forces responded with strikes on Israeli cities, on Gulf infrastructure, on oil facilities. Bahrain reported attacks on fuel tanks. Kuwait's main international airport came under drone assault. Explosions were heard in downtown Dubai. A drone struck Britain's military base on Cyprus. An Iranian ballistic missile was intercepted over Turkish airspace, bringing NATO itself to the edge of direct involvement. The human cost was staggering. The Iranian Red Crescent reported more than 65 schools and 32 medical facilities targeted, over 10,000 civilian sites damaged. And through all of this, every burning oil tanker, every intercepted missile, every frantic emergency session at the United Nations, one country watched from a careful distance: Russia. Part 2. The Russian Factor. Why Moscow holds the key. Nobody is talking about Russia's role in this conflict has been the most consequential underreported story of the entire war. On the surface, Moscow maintained a posture of careful neutrality, publicly calling for diplomatic solutions, condemning strikes on nuclear facilities as violations of international law, and positioning itself as a responsible global actor standing above the chaos. But beneath that surface, Russia was doing something far more significant. According to multiple sources familiar with U.S. intelligence reporting, throughout the course of this war, Russia provided Iran with real-time intelligence, information about the locations and movements of American troops, ships, and aircraft operating in the region. Think about what that means. While American forces were conducting operations against Iranian targets, Russia was feeding Tehran information that allowed Iran to better anticipate, prepare for, and respond to those operations. This was not neutrality. This was a shadow alliance playing out in the intelligence channels that rarely make the front pages. And the relationship ran in both directions. Iran had already been supplying Russia with Shahed drones and short-range ballistic missiles used to target Ukraine. The two countries had built a deep military-industrial relationship forged in the fires of two separate conflicts, Ukraine and the Middle East, that were now intertwined in ways that Western policymakers were struggling to fully comprehend. But Russia's most powerful card was not military. It was diplomatic. Russia sits on the United Nations Security Council. Russia has a veto over any binding international resolution. Russia has economic relationships with virtually every actor in this conflict, with Iran, with China, with the Gulf states, with Turkey, which had just had Iranian missiles intercepted over its own airspace. And Russia had made an extraordinary offer. Moscow proposed to take physical custody of Iran's enriched uranium, to store or reprocess it on Russian soil. This single offer had the potential to cut through the central knot of the entire conflict. The American position was that Iran could not be allowed to possess enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon. If Russia physically held that uranium, that American red line could technically be satisfied, without Iran having to accept what it would view as the humiliation of surrendering its nuclear program under military pressure. It was a diplomatic masterstroke, and it was the offer sitting at the center of every conversation as Arakchi's plane touched down in St. Petersburg. Part 3. The Arakchi Marathon. 48 hours that redrew the diplomatic map. To fully appreciate what happened in St. Petersburg on April 27th, you need to trace the extraordinary diplomatic sprint that preceded it. In the 48 hours before his meeting with Putin, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Arakchi had visited Pakistan twice and Oman. 2 visits to Islamabad in 48 hours, a meeting with Oman's Sultan Haytham bin Tariq in Muscat, and then the flight north to Russia. This was not routine diplomacy. This was a man racing against a clock. Because here is the situation Arakchi was navigating. The ceasefire, brokered by Pakistan on April 8th after more than a month of open warfare, was strained to breaking point. The 2 main sticking points were stark and intractable. First, Iran's nuclear program. The United States insisted that Iran could not be allowed to maintain its current stockpile of highly enriched uranium or continue enrichment activities. Iran insisted that its nuclear program was a sovereign right and a matter of national survival, particularly given that the war had been launched in part as a nuclear strike. Walking away from its nuclear capabilities under the barrel of an American gun was something Tehran believed would only invite future aggression. Second, the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had effectively blockaded the strait, the choke point through which a fifth of the world's daily oil supply moved. The United States was conducting its own naval blockade of Iranian ports. American forces had turned back 38 ships from entering or leaving Iranian waters. The economic pressure on both sides was immense, but the strategic logic of each side's position was equally rigid. Iran saw control of the strait as its ultimate deterrent, the card that kept the United States from escalating further. America saw the blockade as an intolerable threat to the global economy and to its Gulf allies. Pakistan had attempted to bridge these 2 positions through back-channel communications. Arakchi passed Iran's written red lines to the Americans through Pakistani intermediaries. Those red lines were explicit. Nuclear issues and the Strait of Hormuz were non-negotiable. Then, on Saturday, Trump canceled the planned trip to Islamabad by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Senior Advisor Jared Kushner. The reason given was, and this is a direct quote, "tremendous infighting and confusion." The diplomatic track appeared to be collapsing, which is exactly when Arakchi turned his plane north and flew to St. Petersburg. Part 4. The Meeting. What Putin Said, and What It Changes. The meeting between Vladimir Putin and Abbas Arakchi on April 27, 2026, at the Boris Yeltsin Presidential Library in St. Petersburg lasted for several hours. What was discussed is known through official statements from both sides, from Russia's state news agency TASS, from Iran's foreign ministry, and from multiple media organizations tracking every word. And those words were not subtle. Putin did not speak in the careful, measured language of diplomatic ambiguity. He spoke with clarity and conviction. He told Arachi, and by extension he told the entire watching world, "We see how courageously and heroically the Iranian people are fighting for their independence, for their sovereignty." He declared that Russia intends to continue our strategic relationship with Iran. He promised, "For our part, we will do everything that serves your interests, the interests of all the people of the region, so that peace can be achieved as soon as possible." He confirmed that he had received a personal message from Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, who had not yet appeared publicly since assuming leadership following his father's assassination, signaling a direct personal communication channel between the two heads of state. And at the same time that Putin was meeting with Arachi, Russia's defense minister Andrei Belousov was meeting with Iran's deputy defense minister Reza Tlaib in Kyrgyzstan. Two simultaneous military and diplomatic conversations happening in parallel. A coordinated signal from Moscow that Russia was engaging with Iran at the highest possible level, across every dimension of the relationship. For Arachi, the visit served a purpose beyond the words. He briefed Putin in detail on the Pakistani-mediated diplomatic process, on the specific conditions Iran believed could form the basis for renewed negotiations. He blamed the failure of previous talks on what he called Washington's destructive habits, insisting on unreasonable demands, changing positions repeatedly, using threatening rhetoric, and breaching commitments. And he left St. Petersburg knowing that whatever came next, Russia was standing firmly, publicly, and loudly in Iran's corner. Part 5. Why this meeting changes everything. The strategic calculus shifts. Now let us be precise about why this meeting matters, why it has the potential to change the entire arc of this war. It comes down to three things: leverage, legitimacy, and the nuclear offer. Leverage. Before today's meeting, Washington could calculate its pressure on Iran in relatively isolated terms. Sanctions, naval blockade, military strikes. The theory was that Iran, facing economic strangulation and military degradation, would eventually be forced to negotiate from a position of weakness and accept American terms. That calculation has just become significantly more complicated. Russia is not a neutral observer. Russia is actively providing Iran with intelligence. Russia has a veto at the United Nations. Russia has relationships with China, with Turkey, with every actor whose cooperation Washington needs for any kind of durable settlement. A Russia that is publicly, loudly, and militarily aligned with Iran changes the pressure calculus in ways that the White House cannot ignore. Because now the question is not just, can America break Iran? The question becomes, can America afford to break Iran in a way that permanently drives Russia, Iran, and China into a single coordinated bloc against American interests globally? That is a war on a much larger scale than anything happening in the Persian Gulf. Legitimacy. Iran has spent the past 60 days presenting itself as a victim of aggression, a country attacked during negotiations, whose supreme leader was assassinated, whose civilian infrastructure was deliberately targeted. Much of the global South has been sympathetic to this narrative. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America that have long resented American unilateralism have watched this conflict and drawn conclusions. Putin's public declaration of support, his invocation of Iranian courage and sovereignty, is not just rhetoric. It is an act of legitimization on the world stage. It signals to every fence-sitting government that aligning with Iran's diplomatic position carries the backing of a major nuclear power and a permanent UN Security Council member. For Washington, that makes achieving a UN-level diplomatic resolution of this conflict significantly harder. The nuclear offer. This is where Russia's intervention may prove most decisive. Russia's proposal to take physical custody of Iran's enriched uranium addresses the central deadlock of this conflict in a way that no other proposal has managed to do. For America, it offers a path to claiming that Iran's nuclear threat has been neutralized, without requiring the visible humiliation of an Iranian capitulation. For Iran, it offers a path to ending the war and lifting the blockade, without the domestic political catastrophe of appearing to surrender its nuclear program to American demands. For Russia, it offers an extraordinary strategic prize. becoming the essential, irreplaceable broker of the most consequential peace deal in the Middle East in a generation. A Russia that holds Iranian-enriched uranium is a Russia that sits at the center of global security architecture in a way that it has not since the end of the Cold War. Today's meeting was, in large part, about whether this offer has legs, whether Iran is genuinely prepared to accept it, and whether Russia can deliver American acceptance of terms that make that offer politically viable in Tehran. Part 6. Trump's calculation, the president. Between pressure and reality. And what of Donald Trump, the American president who launched this war, who authorized the February 28th strikes alongside Israel, who has maintained the naval blockade, who has overseen a military campaign that struck over 8,000 Iranian targets? Where does he stand tonight? The signals are contradictory, which may itself be the most revealing signal of all. On one hand, Trump has maintained maximum pressure publicly. He canceled the Witkoff-Kushner trip to Islamabad. He said Iran could call if it wanted to talk, a formulation that placed the burden on Tehran and allowed Trump to present himself as negotiating from strength. On the other hand, U.S. gas prices are above $4 a gallon. Brent crude oil is hovering between $86 and $90 a barrel, up from $73 before the war began. The global economy is absorbing shocks that are translating into real pain for American consumers. The stock market, which Trump has always treated as a report card for his presidency, is under pressure. And Trump knows something else. He knows that the Russian factor is real, that a war which becomes a direct U.S.-Russia confrontation, even an indirect one fought through proxies and intelligence, is a war whose costs escalate beyond anything his political calculations can absorb. His own statement after speaking with Putin in a previous call, "The war is very complete, pretty much," revealed a president who wants a victory declaration more than he wants continued conflict. A president who is looking for a door. Russia, and today's meeting in St. Petersburg, may have just provided that door. Part 7. What comes next? 3 scenarios for the days ahead. Scenario 1. The Russian bridge. Russia succeeds in translating today's meeting into a concrete diplomatic framework. Iran accepts, at least in principle, the concept of transferring enriched uranium to Russian custody. The United States, presented with this face-saving formula, agrees to a more durable ceasefire and begins lifting the naval blockade. Oil prices fall. The global economy breathes again. Trump claims victory. Iran claims survival and sovereignty. Russia claims the role of indispensable global power broker. This is the best-case scenario. It is not guaranteed, but it is more plausible today than it was 24 hours ago. Scenario 2. Prolonged stalemate. The diplomatic momentum from St. Petersburg proves insufficient to overcome the fundamental gaps between Washington and Tehran. Iran's red lines on nuclear issues and Hormuz remain incompatible with American demands. The ceasefire holds, but only just. The naval blockade continues. Oil prices remain elevated. The war grinds on at a lower intensity, with neither side willing to escalate to full-scale conflict again, but neither willing to accept terms it views as defeat. This scenario is economically painful for everyone and strategically unsatisfying for everyone. But it may be the most realistic near-term outcome if today's diplomatic momentum cannot be sustained. Scenario 3. Renewed escalation. The ceasefire collapses entirely. Trump, facing domestic political pressure to demonstrate strength, resumes the bombing campaign. Iran, backed by Russia's public pledge of support, retaliates with a new wave of strikes across the Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz escalation intensifies. Oil hits $200 per barrel. The global economy enters severe recession. And a conflict that was already the most dangerous in the Middle East in a generation becomes something far, far worse. Every diplomat working this file today is trying to ensure that this third scenario never arrives. And Russia's intervention, Putin's explicit public backing of Iran, the intelligence sharing, the nuclear custody offer, all of it is designed to create enough diplomatic space, enough off-ramps, enough face-saving formulas that the descent into Scenario 3 can be avoided. The new architecture of power. Visuals. Slow pan across a world map. St. Petersburg, Tehran, Washington, the Strait of Hormuz, ships at sea, the sun setting over the Persian Gulf. Step back from the immediate news cycle and consider what today's meeting in St. Petersburg represents in the broader sweep of history. We are watching in real time a fundamental restructuring of global power. The era of unchallenged American dominance in the Middle East, the era that began with the first Gulf War in 1991 and reached its peak with the 2003 invasion of Iraq, has ended. Not with a single dramatic moment, but through a slow accumulation of decisions, miscalculations, and shifting alignments that have brought us to this point. Iran, a country that has been under crippling sanctions for decades, has demonstrated that it can absorb a military assault from the most powerful military alliance in the world and remain standing. It has closed the world's most important oil choke point. It has forced the United States into a diplomatic process on terms that, 60 days ago, Washington would have considered inconceivable. Russia has demonstrated that it can shape the outcome of a conflict it is not directly fighting, by providing intelligence, by offering diplomatic cover, by making a single nuclear custody proposal that changes the entire negotiating geometry. And China, watching all of this carefully from Beijing, maintaining its own economic relationships with Iran, processing discounted Iranian oil, calculating its next moves in Taiwan and the South China Sea, is drawing conclusions about American power and American resolve that will shape decisions for decades to come. This is the new architecture of power, multipolar, contested, dangerous, and deeply uncertain in its ultimate shape. Abbas Araghchi left St. Petersburg having secured something invaluable: the knowledge that Iran is not alone, that the world's most capable nuclear power has publicly, explicitly, and repeatedly declared its solidarity with Tehran. Whether that solidarity translates into a peace deal or deepens an already dangerous global confrontation depends on what happens in the days ahead. The meeting is over, but its consequences have barely begun to unfold. Stay watching, stay informed, because what happens in the coming 72 hours will determine which of those three scenarios becomes reality. This is not the end of anything. It may be the beginning of everything that comes next.